Hey everybody, my name is Ian O'Byrne. This is another interview that we're having based upon the JAAL, the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy, Multi-Literacies Department columns that we put together. The most recent column that we had was on digital badges and what they look like and could look like and should look like in our classrooms. So I'm really happy to be with two of our authors today on the interview. Dan, you want to introduce yourself, and then James?
Okay. Sure, I'm Dan Hickey. I am an associate professor in the Learning Sciences program at Indiana University. I've been involved with badges almost from the start, but not quite. The work at Mozilla and Peer-to-Peer University that sort of kicked things off. Got involved just a little bit after that, and so I led the Design Principles Documentation project that MacArthur funded, where we studied what happened in the 30 projects that they funded in 2012 to build digital badge systems. And James and I are now leading the Open Badges in Higher Education project, which is just getting underway to support open badges in higher education.
I'm James Willis. I'm a research associate and project coordinator in Dan's lab. Came to Indiana University last summer in August of 2014. I'm helping to sort of coordinate the findings of the DVD project and also coordinate the efforts of the Open Badges in Higher Education project. It's currently underway. And my background is in the humanities, and most of my career has been spent working in educational technology and the assessment of it. And one of the more niche areas that I'm interested in is sort of the ethics of educational technology, and there's a lot of questions that Open Badges and data ask. So this is some of the areas that I'm beginning to publish in now is sort of the ethics of open digital badges.
Very cool. One of the things that we wanted to make sure that we pointed out is that if you read the column, we spend a lot of time talking about one student. We talk about the MOUSE program, but this work, this column is really fueled by larger research that they've been conducting. So we have a lot of the details in there. We'll share more in the blog post. So the purpose of the whole column was we were looking at digital badges, and we were trying to make badges make sense. All of the complexity of badges for educators in secondary, basically K-12 up through higher ed. So that being said, what are digital badges?
Yeah, so as Dan mentioned, when P2PU, which is Peer-to-Peer University of Mozilla, they came up with this idea that if we put specific claims about learning and detailed learning about evidence into artifacts, that could really change things. And in the last few years, it really has. This is a very quickly changing, evolving field in which learners are able to expressly show what they have learned. But to define it specifically, they're web-enabled, evidence-rich credentials that people are able to share. Badges are able to provide evidence of learning. They do so through artifacts that can be customized, that can be examined by others, and that can be verified by experts, for example. So badges allow a huge amount of transparency to exist in many different forms of education. And thanks to MacArthur Foundation and Mozilla, we now have a lot of these expected standards, both for images as well as OBI, or Open Badge Infrastructure Compliance. Kind of where things are now in the field as of this year in 2015, the two major ideas are interoperability, which means that you have badges that can work in other systems and can communicate effectively with other systems, and also extensibility. Extensibility means that designers are thinking purposely about the future, thinking about how the systems of design today can operate with systems potentially in the future. So interoperability and extensibility are kind of the ground level of where we are right now with open digital badges. Dan, would you like to add to that?
Well, just to say that to bring that to bear to this audience, if we think about the typical readers of this journal, that they can probably get the idea that, oh yeah, if a student's work, if their student artifact is contained in that badge, and that badge can travel. So for instance, if let's say a fan fiction, like I love fan fiction, it's always the example I cite of what a social network could be. Well, one of the huge issues with fan fiction is that many teachers refuse to accept fan fiction as work for class credit because they don't know whether that piece was plagiarized. it's a little crazy when you see what happens in fan fiction sites. Well, a badge, if we do this right, that badge should contain enough evidence both of the work that the student did, but also evidence that that student did that work and what they learned while they were doing that work in terms of their interaction with others. If that is all contained literally in the badge in the form of links, then we might be able to solve that problem. And so that rather than just printing out a piece of fan fiction that they found, the fan fiction site could issue a badge, or somebody could award somebody a badge, and that information would be very different than what currently exists in terms of the relationship between fan fiction and schooling.
One of the challenges that we have is that when we look at our classrooms, we always are concerned about student motivation and engaging students in the learning process. I have played a little bit with badges, and I also issue badges in my classes, and I've learned a lot from working with you both, developing this column and on those community calls. How do badges affect student motivation and engagement? Is there any connection? What's happening?
Well, I'm in addition to being an assessment researcher, I'm also a motivation researcher. I've written pretty extensively. There's an article in the elementary school journal that Connie JAAL published in 1999 before she went to the MacArthur Foundation, called Self-Regulation in Democratic Communities, and it was a very inspirational piece for me because it really helped me appreciate these sort of newer, more sociocultural theories of motivation, and helped me really appreciate what they had in mind when they came up with this system. And we've been writing about this quite a bit. We hear all the jokes, don't need no stinking badges. I had a debate with Alfie Kohn last year where he said, oh, badges are just extrinsic motivation. And my response is that we know for a fact that if you give people extrinsic incentives that are arbitrary and unrelated to activity that they already enjoy doing, they will do that activity less. It's called the over-justification effect. It's been documented in hundreds of studies. The point is if we do that with badges, we can guarantee that the exact same thing will happen. In other words, if you give somebody a badge that's arbitrary and unrelated to their work, that's an extrinsic, purely extrinsic incentive, then yeah, you don't do that. Instead, what you need to do is put rich forms of evidence. If you think of, for example, mouse wins in our study, if you were to go to the database under motivating learning, you'd see that the principles that they enacted were that they gave badges for newly recognized skills, rewards for small accomplishments, in this case blog posts, and peer-awarded badges. All three of those are really valued badges that my understanding is the students really they wanted them. They really wanted them. And you can just look at factors, for example, if students don't claim their badges. If you issue badges and students don't claim them, well, it's not motivating them. So the real key here is whenever you're building a badge system, you have to ask yourself, what are we going to do to make this badge so valuable that someone would share it out over Facebook or a social network? And so it's a very different thing. I really think that this debate over incentives is really missing the mark. And if you look at what happens in places like Mouse Wins, Supporter to Reporters Medals, Sweetwater Aquaponds is an aquaponics project in Chicago, their kids really wanted those badges, and they were motivated. They did a good job of making sure that they put stuff in those badges that kids wanted to share with people. So in a particular point I want to make, one of the main negative consequences of extrinsic incentives is that they disempower students. Well, one of the things that they tried to do, but actually ultimately were unable to do in Mouse Wins was, Supporter to Reporters Medals, was to give internships. So in other words, they were going to empower students with their badges. It's really hard for me to imagine how that giving someone, unlocking some ability, giving them some power that they didn't have before, will simultaneously disempower them.
James?
Yeah, so one of the things that comes to mind, and one of the things that I find very, very interesting and encouraging about the data that we have, and kind of doing this deeper dive into the meaning of it, especially coming at it as a humanist, is this idea of community. I mean, one of the things that's very important when you talk about student motivation and engagement, at least from a humanistic point of view, is this idea that you're building community. And I think this is part of a larger cultural discussion about how our technologies, either hinder or help building human relationships and building human communities. And I think that the evidence that we have is really showing how, if you apply certain design principles and you show that in an informal environment, that you can actually really build very productive, helpful communities. And I think that that has some very great larger cultural significance to it.
It's earlier, Dan, you were talking about your work in assessments, and I've been also interested in how badges could be used as a form of assessment. When I was teaching in secondary, my students would have, as I said earlier today, multiple choice tests, or now we have the PARC and Smarter Balance. I would have portfolio assessments or essays. In higher ed now, I have many of the same projects, and so I'm trying to find ways to authentically, effectively build in badging ecosystems into that. So in the research and also in all of your work, what connections do you see or value in badges, and what connections are there between badges and assessment systems?
Great. So I'll start by saying we probably should have flipped these questions, because one of the real answers about the motivational functions of badges is assessment and recognition. The decisions you make about the learning you're going to recognize, and then the assessments you're going to use to generate evidence to support those claims, that's where the motivational impact really comes from. So, but we should always recognize, though, that as David Wiley from Brigham Young exclaimed loudly early on, badges are not assessments. Badges are credentials. They're fundamentally credentials. They contain claims and evidence. You need assessments to generate those claims and evidence. And that was a significant, that's a hard thing. A lot of people realize when they get into education that assessment it's really difficult. And when you then start putting those claims and evidence in public and allowing them to circulate, so quite a few of the projects that we studied really stalled because they realized, oh, we don't have any evidence to support those claims. By the time they figured out what they wanted to claim, then they realized, oh, well, we have to come up with a better assessment system to support those claims. And so in that way, badges, at minimum, are very transformative, but they also can be quite disruptive, as any assessment reforms can be. But if we look at Mouse Wins, the assessment practices that they enacted in their projects that they set out to do and they succeeded, their assessments, they assessed social learning. They used performance assessments. They used peer assessment. They used a computer-based scoring system to offload some of the assessments, because in their recognition practices, they had both sort of, quote, hard skill and soft skills. So they used computer systems to document some of the hard skills, but relied more on peers to document the soft skills. And then finally, their assessment system included these so-called leveled badges. So as you succeeded, you knew what your next step was. So you got some of this motivational appeal that comes from, okay, I made a small accomplishment, but, oh, there's another badge there, and those badges are stacked up against this larger badge that I really want to get. So within the recognition practices, what that does is it lays out this, what is best thought of as a pathway for learning. So that affects, we're talking about recognition, assessment, motivation, all sort of tied up in there. But I think that it's just really important to look at the assessment practices that you have in mind. I want to encourage people. One of the things that we're focusing on in the new project is we're helping higher ed institutions to issue badges, is that the first thing you have to do is you ask yourself, what evidence are you going to put in those badges? Where's that going to come from, and how meaningful is that going to be? If you can put in a student artifact, a student-created artifact, that's great. If you can put in a student-generated artifact with comments from peers, that's good. If you can put in endorsements and promotions from peers, that's even better. Supporter to Reporters medals in the UK was working. It was a youth journalism project, and they did just an amazing job with building in just tons and tons of evidence. You couldn't look at that badge and not conclude that somebody really did something, had really developed some skills and had really accomplished something. James, you want to add?
Yeah, I think to piggyback on that same point about supporter to reporter, we have found things like, for example, that these students had access to new activities. They had access to things like peer mentorships, and I think that is oftentimes sort of overlooked or not emphasized as heavily in the classroom. And I think that badges help sort of push the boundaries. And I think that, especially in this case, some of the data that we have, especially coming out of S2R, supporter to reporter, really substantiates this. I mean, it shows how badges push learning past the classroom and how it can become, for lack of a better word, a more holistic, an enterprise, if you will. And emphasizing these peer mentorships is absolutely critical in developing students, especially in their teen years. So I think that badges function as a fantastic challenge both to curricular design as well as the outcomes and how you're measuring those particular outcomes in the classroom.
It's I mean, our hope in this is that we started this off by saying that we wanted to provide a guide for educators, K-12 and higher ed, and for this journal specifically, secondary and higher ed, for educators to start playing with and integrating badges, developing badges, having their own ecosystem and issuing badges. So our hope is, and we didn't want to, sugarcoat or water down some of the complexity involved in badges. So if we have educators that are out there watching this, reading the column, listening to the interviews, and trying to figure out what this all means, you've seen, the topographical map of what digital badges have to offer out there. You've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. What advice do you have? What are the challenges and the opportunities that people will, head into, things to look out for as they work with digital badges in learning settings?
Well, I'll take the first crack at that. We've already touched on a few of them. The report that we're just about to publish that has just excruciating detail of what happened at these projects. We can summarize much of it in the notion of badges work better. Badges work better in some places than others. 7 of the projects that we studied actually never got their badge system up and running. Another 11 of them, they built the badge system, but the larger ecosystem that they envisioned never took. So, for example, 4-H was a good example. They made badges that were really redundant, right? If you think of 4-H, they have an existing credentialing system in trophies and ribbons, and an existing social network in terms of clubs and county fairs. So when they ran into technical problems, the minute they ran into technical problems with their badge system, people said, this is too much trouble. So they have an existing badge system, but there's no ecosystem. So one of the first, that drives home probably one of the first points, is that don't make redundant badges, and don't make badges that don't have unique information. Another big one was the formality. Mouse Winds had relatively informal badges from the start. They never tried to get school credit, for example. Many of the projects attempted to do this. By far, the single most difficult practice was getting formal backing. So the supporter to reporters medals, they had planned to get external endorsement, have experts review badges, get internships from the BBC. Now, the reason that they are in the success bucket is because they dialed back all of those things. Several of the projects, Providence After School Alliance was a real winner in that they did a great job getting formal credit for after-school work, but it was so challenging that they've actually paused their badge system in Providence. Whereas Sweetwater Aquaponds also tried to get school credit. They basically just dialed it back, and now they're focusing their program on summer activities with no formal credit associated with them as part of the cities of learning. So that's probably the biggest challenge of all, is associating badges with formal credit, getting experts to endorse them. So that's the main sort of thing I want to warn people about, is temper your ambitions and don't, if you already have a recognition system for this more formal stuff, use the badges for the less formal and the more social kinds of learning, because they will work better. James?
Yeah, I think kind of broadening this out a little bit. One of the distinct advantages about badges, one of the
Oops.
Do you lock up?
Yeah, James is frozen. Yeah, he's having. Yeah, one of the things all raised, and so James is what I was going to ask James to talk about a little bit, is he is an expert in digital privacy, And so this is a huge issue with badges because badges are based on email addresses. They are basically verboten under COPA. Several of the programs have these internal badges until people turn 13, and then once they turn 13, they sort of graduate and go on to this bigger system where their badges are actually part of the Open Badges ecosystem made possible because they're 13. So, James, are you back yet?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know technology, it's great when it works.
So I was just mentioning, James, that you are an expert in digital privacy, and that this is a big area when it comes to putting student work is actually not protected under FERPA. It's students' grades that's protected under FERPA. Many teachers are very reluctant to put student work, especially with comments on it. One of the simple workarounds out there is that students get to choose. In my big open online classes that I offer, students couldn't put virtually everything that's happened to them in class or nothing that's happened to them in class, depending on their preferences. And that's one of the ways that technology has enabled us to overcome some of the privacy challenges associated with putting student work out there on the internet. Do you want to add, James?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that some of the greater ethical challenges here have to do with this amount of data that is floating around out there. And, FERPA was enacted several decades ago, and obviously it's undergone some considerable change in interpretation. But I think that we're encountering, an age where students don't necessarily think about privacy in the same way that us old folks do. And I think that that's constantly being redefined. But I think that sort of the bridge between the ethical considerations, the privacy considerations, and also the advantages of badges in general really has to do with intentionality. Instead of let's just throw a bunch of content out there and see what students take from it. This is purposely designing curricula to fit within that. And I think that the privacy and the ethical considerations and the legal considerations are all crafted in a way that allows for that innovation. But I think that it bears some responsibility on us to ask these kind of hard questions, especially when we have this much data that's out there on individuals. Some of it self-disclosed, most of it self-disclosed, and how that should be used. And I think this is kind of a horizon. It's a very good way to focus on kind of where we're going with educational technology in general.
It is remarkable when we think about how much young people today, to be colloquial, how much information and how transparent they are. It's astonishing how much personal stuff that they share openly on the web. So it's quite ironic that there's so much concern about sharing, frankly, much less personal. I mean, your work on a student-generated project is it's just not that. It shouldn't be that sensitive. It should be imbued with meaning, but it shouldn't be imbued with risk. So, anyways, I'm happy to see things coming along in that regard.
So I want to thank you both for taking some time to talk about the broader complexity of the article. We set about to write a piece that gave an overview of the challenges and opportunities involved, in digital badges and in this ecosystem. We wanted to provide, an overview that didn't sugarcoat things, as we said earlier. And so I wanted to thank both of you and Katerina for also working on the piece. The column is out there. I will add all these video interviews together and have blog posts with the questions out there. We urge viewers to read the column and respond back. Try out digital badges in your classroom. Can people get in touch with the two of you if they have further questions or they want more guidance or support?
Yeah, if you can just Google Design Principles Documentation Project, and that'll find our project. My email address is dthickey, and I'm on it all the time.
And I'm similarly addicted to my email. It's JAEDWILL at Indiana, James Willis.
And we are actively seeking collaborators in the higher education space. We do have, we're in a position to provide free consulting and collaboration to people. So, I like to start with my thank you. So, I really want to first of all thank you, Ian, for putting this together. This is awesome. I think that your journal is great when you have one of the most astonishing editorial boards of any journal I've ever seen. So I'm really happy that you took the initiative here. But I also want to say, thanks especially to the MacArthur Foundation, to the Badge Alliance. I want to encourage everybody out there to join the working groups that are at Badge Alliance. This community is in flux and taking shape in a bunch of interesting ways now. There are community calls every week at Badge Alliance that are open to everyone. So, I just can't say enough about the great work that Mozilla Foundation did, and then the folks moving on to Badge Alliance. Carla Casilli, Aaron Knight, and that group have just done an amazing job. So I'm really happy and blessed to be part of this. So thanks again, Ian.
Not a problem. James, last word?
No, I think this is fantastic. I think that badges create a unique opportunity to bring people of multiple different backgrounds together and to have a similar conversation. And I'm looking forward to the future and how this all plays out, and I think this is great. Thank you, Ian, for organizing this.
So once again, I urge you to read the column, watch the videos, listen to the interviews. As they mentioned before, the badge community is very receptive. They are very supportive. There's tons of great people out there that are willing to help, and they want you to enjoy the possibilities that exist with badges. And so with that being said, we'll wrap up.